to a class about the transmission of the Greek New Testament. You may not know that the Bodleian has remarkably interesting and early items illustrating the beginnings of the New Testament, how the writings from the period and the genres of the New Testament came to life, and how they ended up later with very, very different fates. So to start with, I selected the earliest biblical, actually earliest New Testament fragment held by the Bodleian Library. This tiny, tiny little piece of a papyrus codex of the 3rd century contains fragments from the Acts of the Apostles by Luke in a very nice Greek hand with a fully elaborated Greek Christian writing system, abbreviating the divine names as a nomina sacra, which will become the standard for writing Christian texts in Greece for the next millennium, basically. And we have a fully elaborate system here in this early fragment from the early 200s AD, which, if you count, is just about 150, a bit more than 150 years after Christ. So it's very close to, and that because if it's actually the Acts, it is actually even closer to the events. This is an account of Paul's speech in his own defense in front of King Agrippa. So that might have happened quite in the 50s AD, probably, something like that. So this is very close to the events actually recounted in this one. The other fragment is a New Testament genre, again on papyrus codex, written on both sides, but a very different text. This is now regarded as an apocryphal text, but it has a very interesting history for Oxford, because this was found at the famous site of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, within the huge rubbish heap. The two Oxford scholars, Grenfell and Hunt, excavated in the very early 20th century. And this was a landmark piece, a game changer in the excavations. I'm not sure this was the first thing to come up, but this was definitely the first thing to be published by them in the long-lived series of the P-Oxy, the Oxyrhynchus Papyri publication. This is P-Oxy 1.1, so the first ever piece to be published, which was so important that they got extra funding after publishing this to continue the excavations. And this is an apocryphal gospel, now known as the Gospel of Thomas. There are 3 Gospels of Thomas in the early Christian literature. One is a Greek account of the infancy of Christ, so stories about the naughty baby Christ in school. And there's a Gnostic one in Coptic, attributed to the Apostle Thomas, and this is the 3rd one, which is a collection of sayings by Christ, which scholars say that was the earliest layer of compiling the Gospels, collecting sayings only from Christ without the narrative, the framework. It's just sayings. It's like a catalogue of sayings. And the reason how the way they figured out what this is was that there was another papyrus which is now housed at the British Library, which contains the same sayings in a row, but it has the heading, the title, saying that this is the Gospel announced to the Apostle Thomas by Christ. And this is how we know what the title was. But this is an innocent collection, so no heresy, anything. It's more or less the same sayings we have in the canonical Gospels, but without the framework.
Can you read any word for us?
Yes, this is about the story when you criticize your neighbor, and you see the little thing in his eye.
Yeah, the splinter.
The splinter in the eye, and you don't see the big thing.
Yeah.
In your own. That's what goes on this one.
Any particular word you could just read?
Ekvalonto tarfos to enta ophthalmo tu adelphu su.
Can you just point to ophthalmu?
Ophthalmu.
Thank you.
Ophthalmu, yeah.
Yeah. Because that's kind of recognizable as a word.
This one is another very early sort of New Testament Christian text, which is another apocryphal text attributed to James the Apostle, who was regarded as the brother of Christ from the first marriage of Joseph. So it's James writing the Proto-Evangelium, which is the Proto-Gospel, recording the story of the Virgin Mary, her nativity and early years in the temple. And this is a 5th century, these are remains of a 5th century tiny little parchment codex from Egypt, showing you the middle of the double leaf with the sewing here and here, and remains of the 2 inner columns of the little manuscript. You can see how small this was. And this, as I said, these are fragments of the Proto-Evangelium, which is a very early text. It already features in some of the earliest witnesses to the New Testament. For example, the Bodleian Papyri, they have a full copy of the Proto-Evangelium in Greek, attributed to the Apostle. It shows you how early the text is, and how highly regarded it was in the early times, that it was part of sort of a composition of New Testament writings that early. But it is also a very popular and influential text later on. And its significance is clearly shown by this example of a Greek lectionary from the 11th century, showing you homilies and lectionary lessons for various feasts. And this one is open, as you can see it, someone added later on in Latin, September the 8th. And this is the same there in Greek. And this is the lesson for the 8th of September, which is the feast day of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary. And here, and after this heading, it says Logos historikos is genesion tis hyperagias theotokou. So this is a historical narrative meant to be read for the Nativity of the Virgin Mary, singgraphis para Iacovu adelphu tu Kyriou, which was written by James, the brother of our Lord. And this was read during the Matins at a Byzantine church service in the middle of the church, after the 6th ode of the canon, when the explanation of the current feast was usually read by the lectors, the readers. And it clearly says that this was written by an apostle, so the apocryphal character of the work is obvious, but still included in a liturgical lectionary. And this is the highest status a text can reach in the ecclesiastical tradition, that if you read it during a service, at the service in a church, that means that it's fully legitimate and absolutely accepted. And this is an apocryphal text reaching that level. So it doesn't have to be part of the New Testament as a canonical writing, but still can be very influential. And it's due to this text that the church celebrates the Nativity of the Virgin Mary on the 8th of September, and also her entry to the temple on the 21st of November in both the Western and the Eastern tradition. This all derives from this text, which is an apocryphal writing, but still just as influential as a gospel text. The other thing is a similar fragment, again a piece of parchment from a tiny, tiny manuscript, which may have been a personal reading copy of someone, or used as a protective amulet, worn somewhere on the body. But this is a fragment of a narrative which isn't recorded in any of the Gospels. It describes how Christ and his apostles enter the temple in Jerusalem and have a conversation with one of the guardians of the temple about purity, because the man there argues that they did not wash themselves properly before they entered the temple. And then Christ has a dialogue with him about what exactly purity is. Is purity achieved by just washing yourself in water, or you need something else. And this is something we find in other ways in the Gospels about, ritual and spiritual purity. But this particular account is not recorded anywhere else. And this fragment is usually regarded as a piece from an unknown, uncanonical apocryphal gospel. And this status is, I think, it's a bit questionable, because without the context, it's quite daring but very fancy and sensational to make such a claim, and to highlight the dubiousness of that status of this text as an uncanonical gospel. I selected an interesting homily from this liturgical lectionary, which is from the 12th century, which is a reading for, as you can see it here, for the Holy and Great Friday, a homily attributed here to St. John Chrysostom, but probably not written by him. It is from that huge corpus collection of texts attributed to John, but probably not written by him. And this is a homily about the agony of Christ in the garden. And the homilist, who is probably not John Chrysostom, takes a very daring approach to the gospel scene, and with a clever rhetorical device, he addresses Christ himself to explain why he is trying to avoid suffering, asking the Father to take the cup away from him. And when he does that, he enters into an apocryphal dialogue with Christ. And he asks Christ here, that saying, "Teach us, O Lord, and tell us, if you came to suffer, why do you show now reluctance to suffer? Why are you afraid? Why are you saying that let this cup pass from me?" And then the answer comes here with the quotation marks. "It is not because I fear and I have terror that I'm uttering the words, 'Father, let this cup pass from me.' When I pray for the cup of death to pass, I do it so that the enemy and the devil believes that by this prayer the cup will pass. And for this reason he will think that I am a man, and I want to confuse him, and I want to make him unsure. I'm hiding my divine honor behind these human words to deceive the devil." But this is a dialogue. And Christ speaks words which are not recorded anywhere in the Gospels. So imagine if this bit of the manuscript is broken off from the page and you find only this, and then you read the text, and what would you say? Would you say these are unrecorded words of Christ which don't come up anywhere in the Gospels? So this could be an unknown apocryphal gospel, whereas according to the nice heading here, it's just a homily by someone who calls himself John Chrysostom, which means that it's a very clever rhetorical device to explain the scene, the gospel scene, and get it explained by Christ himself. But it's not an apocryphal thing. It is only a mark that we need to be very careful with things like that one, which record apocryphal, non-canonical, unrecorded dialogues by biblical characters, and we need to be careful to designate them as unknown apocryphal writings. And this reminds us of that. And the last piece selected for today is an item that shows how long the tradition of writing apocryphal things goes on. That is not an early biblical, early Christian phenomenon, but it goes on much later. This is a 13th century manuscript on paper containing various homilies and apocryphal texts as well, and the last one in it is a curious text. It calls itself Didaskalia tu Kyriou imon Iesou Christou, so the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's fine. But the way it begins, actually it begins here, very curiously actually. It says, "En tes imeras echines," in those days after the resurrection of Christ from the dead, on the Mount of Olives, all the 12 disciples gathered together around our Lord Jesus Christ to ask him questions. And then Christ appears to answer the questions. There's lightning, thunder, everything. And they start asking their questions one by one. And this starts off exactly like some of the apocryphal Gnostic Gospels start in the Nag Hammadi collection. They start up with the same day, and they always situate themselves in those 40 days after the resurrection of Christ and before the ascension, because we see it in the Gospel of John, that which actually says it explicitly, that Christ appeared to his disciples many times and told many things about the kingdom of heaven which are not recorded in this gospel. That was a very nice starting point to fill that gap. And the Gnostics did that. But this one is a different text. So the scenario is the same, but the questions the apostles ask here are quite funny, because this is all law. What we should do, what should we do with a priest who leaves his wife and makes sex with someone else's wife? This is what the apostles, and then miraculous apparition of Christ, and he said he should be kept away from the altar for 20 years. And then what should we do with someone who had 4 wives? And then, and then the answer again, thunder and lightning, to one of these questions posed by the apostles, that that person should not be allowed to take Holy Communion for this and this many years. So it's really like canon law from a Byzantine collection, but put into this apocryphal framework to make it even more convincing and compelling. And this was a very well-known way in Byzantine literary tradition to compose legal manuals in question and answer format. So it was usually an anonymous question, just marked as question. What should we do to this and this priest? And there was an answer. And this is how basically the manuals were put together. But this one is taking an extra step and puts the question and answer genre of the legal manuals into an apocryphal scenario to make it really compelling, because who would care about, an unknown question in a legal manual? But if it's Christ himself announcing the answer in a miraculous way on the Mount of Olives to his apostles, that is a strong one. And that's what they did in this text. The age of the text is obscure. It comes up in 11th century manuscripts as well, but it is based on the questions asked. It must be a Byzantine composition, because it reflects the Byzantine problems of a typical Byzantine parish. And then the answers are coming from the legal manuals. So it shows us how this sort of ancient genre of a revelation dialogue on the Mount of Olives was used by much later compilers of texts for various purposes. This is the latest piece in the collection we selected for today, and marks the stop our journey where we looked at early New Testament genres and their afterlife in the Middle Ages. Thank you.
Many thanks.